Hello and welcome to our presentation. The title of our presentation is Contrasting Methodologies in Parkinson's Disease Caregiver Research, Qualitative Phenomenology versus Flasserian Classic Grounded Theory, a Novice Researcher's Perspective. Presenting today will be my husband, Dr. Tim White, and myself, Dr. Dawn White. Before we get started, I'd like to give you some background on the caregiving studies that support this presentation. We both participate in Parkinson's disease nutritional studies funded by Colorado Parkinson's Foundation. It was during this work that I realized how much attention is rightly focused on the patient, but how often the caregiver remains in the background, quietly holding everything together. They are truly the unsung heroes. About 5 years ago, I began focusing on Parkinson's caregivers. My first study used a phenomenological descriptive design because I wanted to understand the lived experiences of these caregivers. What I found was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Caregivers consistently struggle, often putting their needs last to care for the ones they love. A couple of years after that study, one of the participants reached out to tell me she had lost her spouse to Parkinson's. She asked me, "What comes next? I feel lost and I can't find anything to hold on to." Not long after, another caregiver contacted me with the same heartbreaking story. That's when it hit me. Something was happening here beyond just daily caregiving. It wasn't just about support in the moment. There was a bigger process unfolding. Caregivers were facing a transition, a change in identity and purpose after their loved one passed. I realized this new question wasn't just about describing an experience anymore. It was about understanding a process and building a framework for what happens next. That's when classic grounded theory became the right choice. Unlike phenomenology, which focuses on meaning and essence, grounded theory is conceptual. It looks at patterns, actions, and relationships to explain what's going on. In this second study, my goal was to dig deeper, to collect stories, compare them, and even let data build toward a theory that could guide others in similar situations.
Hello, I'm Dr. Tim White. As Dawn mentioned, uh, we conducted several projects and research around the Parkinson's patients and their caregivers. Um, we are both involved in the Grounded Theory Fellow program, with Dawn being in cohort 1, and I will be in cohort 3 starting here in September. We both work as professors in healthcare administration, health sciences, and Dawn also does psychology as well. So as we dive into our presentation, we wanted to look at the roots and a little bit of a background. So Herschel is considered the founder of phenomenology. His goal was to strip away the assumptions and get to the essence and the conscious experience by describing the phenomenon exactly as it appears, right? This is why phenomenology is often referred to as descriptive. At the foundation of this approach lies the work um, that Essel had done in looking at uh, the philosophy turns us inward, right? So we use that to look at the lived experiences that shape our understanding of the world. It's not merely a uh, method, but it's also a stance, right? Rather than imposing external theories or predefined categories, this approach really seeks to uncover the essence of the phenomenon as they're experienced. It's interpretive, not explanatory, right? It's concerned with the subjective realities. And then later, Gorgai um, translated Herschel's philosophy approach and the research method. And he developed what we call the descriptive phenomenological method in psychology. And this gave researchers a more structured step to follow and to analyze the lived experiences while still staying true to Herschel's principles. Um, that is what the phenomenological study on the Parkinson's caregivers followed. On the other side of that, we look at the Glasser and Strauss grounded theories, right? And we look through that as a lens with the social process. This approach is rooted in really the pioneering work of Barney Glasser and the framework for understanding the social world that really emerges from his stance of all of his data, right? It's the core, it's the grounded theory emphasis, the dynamic nature of the social interactions and meanings that's really seeking to explain how individuals and groups um, navigate the complex processes. Unlike the methodologies that begin with predefined hypotheses or aim to describe the lived experiences, grounded theory adopts a realistic stance. It treats data as fertile ground for generating conceptual categories and the process explanations. And these tools that help us make sense of these patterns, behaviors, and relationships as they unfold. There are, when we look at the phenomenology, we talk about the guiding question, right? The guiding question for phenomenology is what is it like? Um, this approach focuses on the lived experiences, how individuals perceive and make sense of a particular phenomenon. It's about understanding, again, that experience of from the participant's perspective. In contrast, again, Glasser's classic grounded theory asks, what is going on? And in this approach, we seek to uncover the processes, patterns, and social interactions that we mentioned a few minutes ago. This goal is to generate a theory that really explains the behavior of the social phenomena as it emerges from the data. The key distinction here is that the phenomenology aims to describe and interpret, while the grounded theory um, is used to develop a theory about the process and interactions. So when we look at the purpose of our research, the phenomenology is important. Again, it explains the essence of the lived experiences. It helps people understand what makes sense of their world, gives voices to perspectives that would otherwise and might be overlooked. In healthcare, this captures the human side of the illness, caregiving, or recovery, insights that numbers alone cannot provide. So in our study, it meant uncovering what it was like for the wives of caregivers, of the wives to care for their husbands with Parkinson's disease. On the classic grounded theory side, it's crucial to focus on generating the theory about the social process. It explains what's going on from the human interactions and provides a um, framework for understanding the behaviors and decision making. In healthcare, the grounded theory reveals patterns on how patients and caregivers and providers navigate these challenges, which can help our stakeholders and create informed policies and interventions and provide system improvements. The study is meant to identify spousal caregivers' main concerns after their partner's death and how they address them. The key contrast between the two offers a profound understanding and description of the lived experiences, where the grounded theory constructs more of theories about the behavior and the process. So when we dive into the research questions that we have here, you'll notice the differences here. Um, and we kind of touch on them a couple times during this presentation, but that's because it's important to get the differences down and see those. So the phenomenology research question is, what is the lived experiences of mature women caring for male spouses with Parkinson's disease? The phrasing is it asks what is it like? And that's the classic hallmark of the phenomenology query, getting to the essence of the human experience. And in this method, we see that it explores subjective perceptions, emotions, and meanings that people assign to their experiences. Um, on the classic grounded research question that's in there, we see what are the main concerns for the spousal caregivers who have lost their spouse to Parkinson's disease, and how do they address these concerns? So here it's more of an action oriented on what is going on. It focuses on discovering the process, the response, and the behavior, the behaviors. It aims to generate a substantive theory explaining these processes and these interactions. So it often asks, how does this process happen? What are the stages? And what are the patterns?
In phenomenology, we rely mostly on in-depth reflective interviews. The goal is to really understand what it feels like to live through a particular experience. So questions are open-ended, like, can you describe your experience of whatever the phenomenon is? The researcher works hard to set aside their own assumptions, listening closely and using gentle prompts to bring out rich details. It's more of a conversation than an interrogation, and participants are seen as co-authors of their story rather than just a source of data. In classic grounded theory, we draw from many types of data: interviews, observations, even documents. Interviews usually start broad, but as themes begin to emerge, the questions shift and become more focused. This is called theoretical sampling. The emphasis is on building theory step by step through constant comparison, not just describing experiences. By the end, the interviews might feel more structured because they're designed to fill a gap and strengthen categories that support the emergent theories. Now let's focus on some key contrast. Phenomenology is really about getting to the heart of an experience, uncovering what's going on. Classic grounded theory, on the other hand, is more about building the framework. It's focused on explaining how things connect. Even though both may use interviews, their goals are different. Phenomenology digs deep into feelings and meanings, while grounded theory looks for patterns, relationships, and flow to create a larger picture. In phenomenology, the analysis is about drilling down into the participants' stories to uncover the core meaning of their lived experiences. The researcher is looking for the essence, what the experience really means to the people living it. It's less about building a model and more about describing the depth of the human experience. In classic grounded theory, the focus is different. Here, everything counts as data, not just interviews, but also observations, documents, and casual comments. The goal isn't simply to describe, it's to develop conceptual categories and processes that explain what's happening. This is why we say grounded theory is conceptual rather than descriptive. It moves towards building a theory that helps explain the flow of action and relationships. So side by side, you can see that contrast. Explanatory and descriptive for phenomenology, and theory building for grounded theory. In phenomenology, you start with the raw material, participants' own words and stories. The first step is reading and rereading the transcripts, looking for significant statements. The intent is to find phrases that really capture an experience or feeling. These statements are pulled out and clustered together into meaning units or small groups of related ideas or emotions. Through reflection and interpretation, those clusters start to form patterns. From there, you refine and combine them into themes. These are the bigger ideas that capture the essence of the experience. For example, a widow saying, "I can't drink coffee without thinking of her," and another saying, "Every morning feels empty without her at the table," might come together under the theme "Everyday Reminders of Loss." Throughout this process, the researcher keeps bracketing assumptions, staying aware of the personal biases so the themes truly reflect the participants' voices. On the other hand, classic grounded theory uses open coding, selective coding, and theoretical coding as part of their analysis. All of the coding is done using gerunds or action words that end in ing, like feeling, following, or even navigating. For me, when I started the coding portion of the analysis, I began putting each sentence in a table on a Word document. Then I began to write gerund codes that conceptualized what the speaker was talking about. For instance, if the speaker said, "Since she passed, I feel like I'm moving through life in a fog. Everything reminds me of her, and even simple things like making coffee bring up a wave of sadness I wasn't expecting." Now, you could open code this as feeling, remembering, or even adjusting. At this stage, one is not better than the next. Early on, feeling might just be one of the many codes capturing emotional states. As you compare and constantly compare across interviews and situations, you start to see these feelings keep showing up and how they connect. During selective coding, you zoom out and look at the bigger picture. You're asking, what's the main process here? How do these feelings relate to other actions or experiences? That single code feeling might grow into a broader category like navigating emotional transitions after loss, or even carrying grief through daily life. By the end, these categories help shape core concepts or theory that explains the overall journey of widowers in caregiving and bereavement. One of the most powerful tools in classic grounded theory is memoing. In fact, Glasser considered it a core part of the original method, not just an optional step. Memoing is more than taking notes. It's a running record of your analytic thinking, the connections you see, the questions that you come up with, and the possible categories you're forming as you compare data. Every time you code, you write memos to capture why you coded it that way and how it might link to other codes. This habit helps you avoid losing insight in the middle of the analysis. Memos also encourage reflexivity and creativity. They allow you to explore hunches, jot down comparisons, and test out conceptual ideas without worrying about getting it right too early. Over time, memos become the bridge between the raw data and the emerging theory. They are where the categories take shape, where selective coding decisions get justified, and where you start to see the bigger conceptual framework. While memoing is a hallmark of grounded theory, I found it so helpful that I'd argue it could strengthen any qualitative approach, including phenomenology. But in classic grounded theory, it's absolutely essential for theory building. I bet you are asking yourself about a literature review. How does that work into the two differing methodologies? In phenomenology, literature review is usually done up front. The purpose here is to understand what's already known, and most importantly, are there any gaps that need to be identified? This helps justify why the phenomenology study is important and sets the stage for exploring the lived experiences. In classic grounded theory, things work a little different, actually very differently. Here you hold back on a full literature review until after you've collected and analyzed your data. Why? Because you don't want existing theories and prior findings to bias or force the data. The goal is for the theory to emerge directly from the participants' experiences. Once your category and core concepts have developed, that's when you bring in the literature, using it to support, challenge, or extend the theory you're building. Building the key contrasts together. Phenomenology uses literature at the beginning to guide the questions and gaps. Grounded theory uses literature later to back up the theory and to show how it fits or doesn't fit with what's already out there. This simple flowchart shows where memoing fits into classic grounded theory. We start with raw data, break it into codes, and then we pause and write memos. Notice that in all of this, there's a constant comparison that's going on between all of the interviews. The memos are where the real thinking happens. They capture your insight, comparisons, and emerging ideas. Without memos, codes might just sit as disconnected puzzle pieces. The memos will start to link together into categories and form larger categories. We eventually build a theory. That's why Glasser insisted memo is not optional. It is the engine that drives the analysis forward. In phenomenology, the goal of the analysis is to uncover the essence of the lived experience. We start with the data, usually interviews, and carefully identify significant statements, the words that really capture the experiences. Those are grounded in the meaning units, which help us use patterns across participants. At this point, reflective notes are very important. Just as memoing keeps classic grounded theory analysis moving forward, reflective writing in phenomenology keeps a research honest. These notes help with bracketing, being aware of your own assumptions, and also with noticing where your interpretations might shape how themes develop. Finally, the analysis accumulates in themes, which represents the essence of the experiences across participants. So while memoing builds towards theory, reflective writing in phenomenology builds towards essence and meaning. Both are about making sense of the data, but the destination is completely different. So what is the role of the researcher? In phenomenology, the researcher aims to capture lived experiences described by the participants. They also use bracketing, which means they set aside their personal assumptions, in some cases, prior knowledge and bias, to reduce their personal influence on the data collection and analysis. The purpose is to focus on their lived experiences instead of the researcher's interpretations of what they are experiencing. With classic grounded theory, the main focus is to discover theory based on all of the data. Using theoretical sensitivity, I was able to recognize what was meaningful in the data, develop categories and relationships while still allowing emerging concepts. Overall, the intent is to allow the data to speak to you instead of you speaking to the data. So once you've created your study, written your purpose statement and your research question, received IRB approval, recruited your participants, collected your data, and done your analysis, then it's time to bring everything together in your final write-up. For a phenomenology study, the write-up will focus on themes and sub-themes you discovered from your participants' lived experiences. You will illustrate these themes, ensuring the participants' voices remain central. In the discussion section, these findings are connected back to the existing literature review, you did earlier in the process, highlighting similarities, differences, and contributions. In contrast, grounded theory relies heavily on memos you created during the analysis phase. These memos capture your reflections and conceptualizations of the participants' words and experiences. In the write up, memos become the backbone of the developing theory. You organize them into a theoretical outline that demonstrates how categories and subcategories interrelate, gradually building towards the integrated theory that offers a higher level explanation of the phenomenon. In short, phenomenology culminates in rich thematic description of participants' experiences, while grounded theory emphasizes constructing a substantive theory from systematically coding and organizing data. So let's be honest. Research can sound intimidating, but it can also be fun. Think of it like detective work. You're following clues, piecing together stories, and discovering insight no one has uncovered before. Starting with phenomenology or classic grounded theory can feel overwhelming, but remember, both approaches are about curiosity and openness to discovery. For phenomenology, trust the process of bracketing. You won't perfectly remove all biases, but self-awareness and reflection are powerful tools to keep you focused on the participants' lived experiences. For classic grounded theory, let the data guide you. Theory emerges step by step. You don't have to have all of the answers before you begin. For both, embrace learning by doing. Mistakes and revisions are part of the becoming a strong researcher. Memo often, reflect, and stay flexible. And most importantly, value your role. Your willingness to listen deeply and think critically helps give voice to participant and build meaningful knowledge.
So as we wrap up today, um, in qualitative research, um, the choice of methodology shapes not only what we learn, but how we come to understand it, right? The two foundational approaches, phenomenology and classic grounded theory, offer distinct yet complementary lenses for exploring the human experience. Phenomenology is descriptive at its core. It seeks to understand the essence of lived experiences and what it's like to encounter that phenomenon, how individuals perceive it, and what meanings they assign to it, right? This approach invites us to um, the emotional and cognitive interior of um, the nuance and um, the human life, right? And what we get. Um, on the classic grounded theory side, by contrast, is conceptual and process oriented. It focuses on identifying patterns, relationships, and the social processes that emerge from empirical data. Um, Rather than describing the experience, it looks to explain how things unfold and how the different behaviors connect and they operate from a theory that's built from the ground up. So you can think of it this way that the phenomenology reveals the texture and the tone of the experience, whereas the grounded theory is more about the movement, the structure, and the process behind it. Together, these methodologies offer a full picture. One captures meaning and depth, the other builds structure and explanation. So, whether we're exploring the emotional landscape of caregiving um, and the dynamics that shape it, both approaches help us understand the human experience in ways that are rigorous and actionable. So,
Well, we'd like to thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions, You can contact us at one of our email addresses, which are listed below. And we really appreciate you taking the time to watch our video. Thank you.